you are here at home in the 33311. I want you to talk to us today about this community and how it has empowered you, the values that you learned as a young woman growing up here, and how they still inform your life today.
Thank you, Dr. Hobbs. I am a proud product of the 33311. This community is near and dear to my heart. It's a community that I was born and raised in. I feel like I'm honored to be a part of such a rich legacy in this community. I grew up at a time when this community was really, really strong. I remember Sistrunk being a very valuable business district where I was always excited as a young person to go down Sistrunk because it gave me an opportunity to sometimes see Dr. Morris or Dr. Sistrunk or Mr. Korn, but there were a lot of African American business owners that had businesses and medical offices and dental offices on Sistrunk. We had Doris and Benny who owned Little Palace, and they had a boutique. And so we got to see what I grew up thinking is very, very famous people who were real people that were part of our community. I remember interacting with Miss Ellen Walters and Miss June Chisholm, who were teachers that were very integral in my education because I was one of those slow kids that was very challenged at school, but they were friends of my grandmother, so she would take me to them after school and on Saturdays. And eventually, with their gifts and talents and their switches and belts, I eventually learned how to read. But the community was a rich community where everybody was in everybody's business. If you did anything, the whole community knew. Anybody would whip you. It was just a lot of love. Like, we had Mr. and Mrs. Roll that lived on the right side of us. So sometimes we would have these fish fries. So, you know, we might have had the fish. We could go next door to Miss Rose and get the bread, and then we could go to the other side to Miss Walters and get the mustard. And at the end of it, everybody in the community was participating some kind of way in the fish fry. It was also a time where grown folk were adamant about children staying in a child's place. So certain conversations you were not allowed to participate in because it was conversations for grown folk. Education was a major priority. My grandmother actually had a 7th grade education, and although we lived one block way away from New Mount Olive, she was never a member, but she sent me because in her mind it was where the educated people went to church at. And her whole mantra for my life was that I was supposed to be educated. So she sent me where I could be amongst people who would ultimately help me to get where she thought I needed to be.
And you bring up your grandparents. That was something that I really wanted you to share with our audience. In our brief conversation, they really struck me as just really amazing people. Agnes and Ike, who shaped you, raised you, really. Could you talk a little bit more about your relationship with your grandparents?
Certainly. I was a product of teen parents. My mom and dad were 15 and 16 when they had me. They were attending Dillard. My mom, Linda Wade, my dad, Alfred Randall. Many people know him as Sparkplug. I hear that he was very popular. Actually, some of the elderly sisters right now, when I say his name, they give me certain reactions that I don't want to know the story behind the story. But I was a product of 2 teen parents who were very young. My grandmother brought me home at 2 days old from the hospital, and I was the apple of her and my granddad's eye ever since. They both worked in the laundry as pressers in what used to be known as Warren Laundry that was downtown. They had very little education, but they were very smart people and they worked very, very hard. They always provided for me. I didn't know what this whole notion of being poor or, you know, being less fortunate was, because we always had in our house, my grandmother and granddaddy were very clever. They taught me a strong work ethic. I think I started having chores like at 8, And since I was the only child, I did all the chores, so I would have to cut the lawn and just whatever the chore was. It was no gender bias or gender discrimination. They had a rule, you know, the cleaning up and the chores were for the young people. I actually remember asking my dad for a car. I was always really tall, so I started driving at about 12. And I remember asking my dad for a car, and he told me, sure, you know, he was very excited. And he took me over to Winn-Dixie to fill out an application to get a job. And he said, anything that you wanted in life, it was certainly worth working for. So they always taught me how to work. They always saw them work really hard. And one of their greatest assets that they passed on to me was a strong work ethic. And I see it play out a lot in my life today, that I'm able to work multiple jobs because it was what was instilled in me early on as a young child. They also were very strict. You always said yes ma'am and yes sir to people that were older. I will say sometimes now I'm amazed when I say yes ma'am and yes sir to elderly people, and they'll say, oh, just call me John or just call me Mary. I'm really not that old. Because it was a time when yes ma'am and yes sir was a sign of respect, and it showed respect for your elders. So I still do that today because I remember getting those whippings for not addressing older people properly. So my grandmother conditioned me to do that. But my grandparents, my grandmother was from Cairo, Georgia. My granddad was from Walterboro, South Carolina. And they were not extremely educated people, but they were people that loved people, and they loved me. No matter how undesirable I was always tall, very thin, caught all the Miss Banana, Miss Pancake jokes, was really bullied a lot by the kids, and the fact that I couldn't read really added to it. I had this one gift. I would hang out with my granddad and I would watch wrestling every Saturday at 12 with Gordon Soley. And I learned how to master a lot of those moves, the headlock, the figure four. So I would go to school and affectionately apply those moves to children that would call me names. And it would get me in a lot of trouble in school. But my grandmother and my grandfather, no matter how undesirable I was, they always found a way to make me feel special and make me feel like I was the most important person in the whole wide world.
And that was the other thing that struck me in your conversation about your grandparents. Not only, number one, that they cared for you, taking you home at 2 days old and providing for you, the image and the model of hard work that they gave you, but they also had incredibly high expectations for you. When you were confronted with educational challenges at a young age, your grandmother said that would not be for you. She pushed you. Can you talk a little bit more about how they really kind of spoke over you, as we say, in the church?
Yes, my grandmother came from a very large family. She had 15 brothers and sisters, and they all had to stop school early at some point to work in the farm. But her whole mantra was that she was going to make sure that I got the opportunities for education that she didn't get. And I actually remember my granddad worked for a long time as a construction worker. And at some point he got a promotion. And I remember to this day using a burgundy algebra book to teach him the math that he needed to pass the test for the promotion. So my grandparents raised me always with the idea or concept that I would go farther in life than they did, that I would be educated, that I would take advantage of all the opportunities that they used to tell me that people died for me to have. So they set me on that path, and there were times I really, really struggled. I remember being in 3rd grade at Northside Elementary School and having this teacher by the name of Miss Swallows, who told me that I would never learn how to read, I would never amount to anything. I remember during reading time, I hated it because she would sit me in the corner with the coloring book, and then on certain days they would put you on a short bus. That was for the kids that, you know, really wasn't getting it. But they would put you on a short bus and send you over to a special reading place for you to get extra help with reading. And when we would line up for that short bus, other kids would always call us dummies, and they would say, oh, there's the biggest dummy in the back, because I was the tallest. So I remember very early on, I would get a stomach ache or come up with some excuse not to go get on the line for the short